They told them to bring suitcases, to label their names neatly, to remember their address, because they were being resettled. Old men carried prayer books. Mothers held children tighter as the train doors slammed shut. None of them knew that every minute after this point had already been calculated. Every step had already been rehearsed. Every breath they were about to take had been budgeted by men in uniforms who would never learn their names. This is not a story about chaos. It's a story about order, about schedules, rail lines, paperwork, timetables, and silence. About how murder stopped being emotional and started being efficient. In less than 2 years, over 1 million people would vanish in a forest that no longer speak, into camps that were never meant to leave ruins behind, into a system so precise that most victims were dead within hours of arrival, without ever knowing where they truly were. There were no selections, no chance to survive by luck or skill, only arrival and disappearance. The trains kept coming. The smoke kept rising, and the world kept turning as if nothing unusual was happening at all. This was not Auschwitz. This was something faster, quieter, more final. This was Operation Reinhard. The snow was already stained before the bodies hit the ground. Boots crunched against frozen earth as men were pushed forward in uneven lines, their breath visible in the cold air, their hands numb long before the bullets arrived. Somewhere behind them, engines idled. Orders were shouted, clipped and impatient. This was not chaos. It was procedure. A rifle cracked, then another, then many more, until sound itself lost meaning and became only pressure in the chest. When it was over, the silence felt heavier than the gunfire, broken only by the wind moving through bare trees and the dull thud of bodies settling into shallow pits. This was the Eastern Front in the summer and autumn of 1941, after Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the moment when war transformed into something far darker, when conquest gave way to annihilation. Behind the advancing Wehrmacht followed special units whose mission was not to fight soldiers, but to erase entire populations. They moved from village to village, town to town, gathering Jewish men, women, and children with practiced efficiency. At first, the killings were small. A few dozen here, 100 there. But as the front expanded, so did the scale. Entire communities were marched out to fields, forests, ravines. They were told to undress, to turn around, to kneel, and then they were shot. By the end of that year, hundreds of thousands were already dead. The method was simple, direct, brutally intimate. A man looked into the back of another man's head and pulled a trigger, again and again, day after day. But simplicity came with a cost. Ammunition had to be transported. Graves had to be dug. Villages had to be cleared and controlled. And the men doing the killing began to crack. Reports filtered back to Berlin describing drunkenness, breakdowns, nervous collapse. Officers complained that their troops could not continue indefinitely, shooting women and children at close range, hearing screams, feeling the recoil travel up the arm and into the shoulder, left marks that even ideology could not fully erase. There were other problems too. The killings were visible. Locals saw them. Soldiers talked. The ground itself betrayed the crime as mass graves shifted and bled into the soil. The stench of decay followed the units as they moved on. This was supposed to be a secret war, a solution carried out beyond the gaze of the world. But bullets were loud. Graves were hard to hide. And each killing took time. Too much time. As 1941 dragged on, Nazi leadership began to confront a reality they had not anticipated. The murder of millions could not rely on improvisation forever. The Einsatzgruppen had demonstrated willingness. They had proven intent, but they had also revealed the limits of mobile killing. If the goal was total extermination, something faster was needed. Something quieter. Something that removed the human element as much as possible. At the same time, the Jewish population of occupied Poland remained immense. Ghettos in Warsaw, Lublin, Krakow, and dozens of smaller cities were bursting beyond capacity. Hunger stalked the streets. Disease spread unchecked. Bodies lay uncollected in alleyways, wrapped in rags or newspaper. German administrators complained constantly about food shortages, sanitation crises, and the sheer difficulty of controlling so many people marked for death, but not yet killed. The ghettos were never meant to be permanent. They were holding pens, and now they were full. Inside offices far from the gunfire, men studied maps, transport schedules, and population statistics. They spoke in neutral language. Evacuation, resettlement, special treatment. They reduced lives to numbers, locations, logistical obstacles. What they needed was not another massacre in a forest, but a system. A place where trains could arrive on schedule, where victims could be processed quickly, where killing could occur without spectacle, without emotion, without witnesses who might later speak. The idea was not entirely new. Earlier programs had already tested the boundaries of mass murder. Disabled Germans had been killed in institutions using gas under the guise of medical care. The lessons were clear. Gas was quieter than bullets. Centralized facilities were easier to guard and conceal. Staff could be trained to follow routines rather than improvise violence. Most importantly, distance could be created between killer and victim. A door could be closed. A valve could be turned. Death would happen on the other side, unseen. What was now required was scale. The invasion of the Soviet Union had radicalized everything. The war was no longer about territory alone. It had become a racial crusade, framed as a fight for survival against an imagined enemy. In this atmosphere, restraint vanished. What had once been debated in abstract terms was now demanded immediately. The question was no longer whether European Jewry would be destroyed, but how quickly it could be done. By late 1941, discussions intensified about shifting the center of killing away from open fields and into fixed locations designed for that single purpose. Eastern Poland offered the ideal conditions. Remote forests, sparse non-Jewish populations, dense railway networks connecting ghettos to the rest of the occupied territories. It was a place where people could disappear and where their absence would raise little immediate alarm. The men designing this new phase understood something critical. The killing itself was only one part of the process. There had to be order before death and silence after. Victims needed to be deceived long enough to prevent panic. Belongings needed to be collected and redistributed. Bodies needed to vanish without trace. And the entire operation had to run continuously, day after day, without pause, without attention. What the Einsatzgruppen had done in the East was brutal, but it was inefficient. Too many variables, too many eyes, too much strain on the men involved. What was coming next would be different. It would feel cleaner to those carrying it out. More modern, more rational. Murder redesigned as an administrative task. The shift was subtle at first. Orders became more abstract. Responsibility moved upward, away from the men pulling triggers and toward offices where plans were drawn up in ink rather than blood. Trains were discussed more often than rifles. Timetables replaced firing squads. The language hardened, but the emotions were drained from it. Killing was no longer described as an act, but as an outcome. In the ghettos, rumors spread. People whispered about trains that never returned, about villages emptied overnight, about smoke rising where there had once been fields. Some refused to believe it. Others understood exactly what it meant and felt the slow suffocation of waiting for a death that had not yet arrived. The uncertainty was its own form of terror. Hunger gnawed. Typhus spread. Hope narrowed to the next day, then the next hour. German officials complained that the ghettos were unstable. That starvation was too slow. That disease was unpredictable. Death, they believed, needed to be controlled, managed, scheduled. By the end of 1941, the conclusion was unavoidable. Mass shootings had carried the regime far, but not far enough. The future of extermination lay not in forests and ravines, but in camps designed from the ground up for killing. Places with no pretense of labor or resettlement beyond the lies told at the gates. Places where the process could be perfected. What was about to emerge was not an escalation of violence, but a transformation of it. A system that stripped murder of its messiness and replaced it with routine. A program that would erase entire communities with terrifying speed, leaving behind almost nothing but ash, paperwork, and silence. The invasion of the Soviet Union had cracked something open. The shootings had revealed both the will to destroy and the need to do it differently. And now, in the shadows of occupied Poland, plans were forming that would turn genocide into an industrial operation. The trains had not yet begun to run. The camps had not yet been built. But the decision had already been made. And once it was, there would be no turning back. The explosion came without warning, ripping through the narrow Prague street in a flash of smoke and metal. For a fraction of a second, everything froze. The car, the driver, the uniformed figure inside, before the shock wave shattered the illusion of control that had surrounded one of the most powerful men in Nazi Europe. Glass burst outward. Steel screamed. And, as the dust settled, Reinhard Heydrich lay wounded, bleeding into the seat of his open-top Mercedes, his authority suddenly reduced to a body struggling for breath. In Berlin, the news landed like a thunderclap. Heydrich was not just another official. He was the architect of terror, the man who turned ideology into machinery. Head of the Reich Security Main Office, master of intelligence, surveillance, and repression, he had been feared even within the Nazi leadership. He had shaped the structures that made mass murder possible, coordinating police, SS, and intelligence into a single, obedient instrument. And now, in the occupied streets of Prague, that instrument had faltered. For days, the regime waited. Doctors fought infection. Orders continued to move across desks. The war did not pause. But when Heydrich finally died in early June of 1942, the reaction was swift and ferocious. Retaliation followed immediately. Entire villages were erased. Men shot, women deported, children murdered or taken away. The message was clear. The Reich would answer blood with oceans of blood. But beneath the rage and the spectacle of vengeance, something else was happening. Heydrich's death created a vacuum at the very heart of the machinery that had been evolving since the invasion of the Soviet Union. Plans he had overseen were now pushed forward with renewed urgency, almost as if his absence demanded proof that the system he built could function without him. The solution, they believed, was not to slow down, but to accelerate. Heydrich's name did not fade. Instead, it hardened into a symbol. Within weeks, a massive extermination program in occupied Poland was officially designated with his name. Operation Reinhard, not as a memorial in the human sense, but as a declaration, a signal that the path he had helped chart would be followed to its most extreme conclusion. By this point, the framework for annihilation was already in place. The ghettos were overcrowded beyond survival. The Einsatzgruppen were exhausted, both materially and psychologically. The leadership in Berlin had accepted that the murder of Europe's Jews was no longer a future goal, but an immediate task. Heydrich's death did not create this decision. It removed the last hesitation around how ruthlessly it would be carried out. Responsibility for transforming this vision into reality fell to men who had learned their trade not on battlefields, but in back rooms and institutions where death was disguised as care. Veterans of the so-called euthanasia program were quietly reassigned. These were men who understood gas chambers, deception, and the importance of routine. They knew how to kill efficiently and how to keep it hidden. The language surrounding the operation grew colder. No longer did reports dwell on shootings or executions. Instead, they spoke of evacuations, transfers, special actions. Trains became the central focus. Schedules were drawn up with precision. Rail lines mapped ghettos to destinations that did not officially exist. Each transport was a calculation. How many people, how long the journey, how quickly the next train could arrive. In occupied Poland, the ground was already being prepared. Forests were surveyed. Rail spurs quietly extended. Local authorities were instructed to cooperate without question. Everything was designed to look temporary, insignificant, easy to erase. These were not camps meant to last. They were tools, built to function at maximum intensity and then disappear. Meanwhile, inside the ghettos, the pressure increased. Deportations that had once been sporadic now became systematic. German officials spoke openly of clearing entire districts. Jewish councils were ordered to compile lists, to organize assemblies, to ensure calm. Resistance was crushed quickly and publicly. Fear became another administrative instrument. What made this moment so dangerous was not just the violence, but the certainty. By mid-1942, doubt had vanished from the upper ranks. The question was no longer how far they would go, but how efficiently they could proceed. The death of Heydrich had removed one of the last figures capable of moderating internal rivalries. His legacy now demanded results. Operation Reinhard was not announced with speeches or proclamations. It unfolded quietly, behind closed doors, in typed orders and verbal instructions. It was deliberately narrow in scope and brutally vast in consequence. Its target was clear: the Jewish population of the general government in occupied Poland. Its method was absolute extermination. Its timeline was immediate. The transition from idea to action happened with chilling speed. Construction began almost simultaneously at multiple sites. Materials were scarce, but ingenuity compensated. Wooden structures replaced stone. Engines replaced bullets. What mattered was not durability, but throughput. People would arrive. People would die. And then the next train would arrive. Unlike earlier camps, these places were not designed for labor, punishment, or imprisonment. They existed for one purpose only. From the moment the first transport arrived, survival rates would approach zero. The victims would not be registered. They would not receive numbers. Their names would vanish with them. Even among the perpetrators, the shift was felt. Killing no longer required the same direct confrontation. Orders were followed. Tasks were divided. Responsibility blurred. One man guarded a gate. Another supervised unloading. Another handled belongings. Death occurred behind walls, out of sight. It was easier to pretend it was not happening. And yet, the scale of what was being prepared was unprecedented. Entire regions were scheduled for liquidation. Ghettos that had existed for years were suddenly emptied in weeks. The speed was staggering. The intention unmistakable. Heydrich's death had not slowed the genocide. It had sanctified it. His name became a banner under which extermination was rationalized, intensified, and perfected. Operation Reinhard was no longer an abstract plan. It was an active, expanding system, consuming resources, lives, and time with ruthless efficiency. As summer approached, the trains began to move more frequently. Whispers turned into screams. People vanished. Smoke rose from places that were not marked on maps. The machinery was no longer theoretical. It was alive, humming, waiting. And with every transport that departed a ghetto, the operation moved closer to its true form. One that would soon reveal just how fast, how silent, and how final industrialized death could be. The train did not stop for long. Steam hissed, metal groaned, and then it was gone again, disappearing down a line that cut through forests and marshland, carrying with it orders that would never be written down in full. Somewhere inside the Reich, desks were being cleared, authority redistributed, names reassigned to functions that had to keep moving. Heydrich was dead, but the system he built did not pause to mourn. It adapted. It always did. Power in the Third Reich was never neat. It flowed through rival offices, overlapping chains of command, personal loyalties, and silent feuds. And yet, when it came to extermination, chaos had no place. Someone had to take control of the machinery that was now fully in motion. Someone had to ensure that the trains ran on time, that the camps were supplied, that the killing remained hidden, fast, and uninterrupted. That man was Odilo Globoknik. He did not look like a master planner. He lacked Heydrich's cold elegance, Himmler's theatrical mysticism. He was blunt, abrasive, often dismissed as crude. But what he possessed was something far more dangerous: absolute loyalty to the idea of annihilation, and an instinct for ruthless efficiency. As SS and police leader of the Lublin district, he controlled a region that had quietly become the heart of Nazi extermination policy. Lublin was not Berlin. It was not Vienna or Munich. It was a place people passed through, not a place they watched. And that made it perfect. Globoknik understood something his superiors valued deeply. Extermination did not need spectacle. It needed distance. It needed obscurity. It needed a place where screams could dissolve into trees, where smoke could drift unnoticed, where entire populations could vanish with little administrative friction. The general government of occupied Poland offered all of that. By late 1941, Globoknik was already assembling his team. He did not recruit randomly. He selected men with experience in killing that did not leave visible scars on the perpetrators. Former Action T4 personnel, technicians, administrators, men who had already learned how to deceive victims, how to seal doors, how to record numbers without emotion. These were not frontline soldiers. They were specialists. They worked quietly. Their orders were often verbal. Paper trails were minimized. When documents were produced, the language was deliberately vague. Nothing described what was actually happening. Everything was couched in euphemism. Resettlement, special handling, evacuation. Even within the SS, few fully understood the scope of what was being planned. Globoknik reported directly upward, bypassing layers that might interfere. His mandate was simple and terrifying in its clarity. Remove the Jewish population of the general government as quickly and completely as possible. Not imprison them. Not deport them east. Remove them. Permanently. What made his role so central was not just authority, but coordination. Operation Reinhard was not a single action. It was a network. Rail officials, construction crews, camp guards, police battalions, local administrators, all had to move in synchronization. A delay in one place meant chaos elsewhere. And chaos was the enemy. The camps under his control were designed to be invisible. No grand gates. No slogans. No permanent stone buildings. Wooden barracks. Fences. Engines repurposed to produce lethal gas. Everything was temporary by design. These were tools, not institutions. Once their task was complete, they would be dismantled, erased, and forgotten. But before that could happen, they had to operate at full capacity. Globoknik's office became the nerve center of extermination. Reports flowed in daily. Numbers were tallied. Not names. Not lives. Numbers. How many arrived? How many were processed? How much clothing collected? How much gold extracted? Efficiency was measured not in morality, but in output. The scale was staggering. Entire ghettos were scheduled for liquidation. Timetables were drawn up that left no room for hesitation. When resistance occurred, it was crushed immediately. When transports backed up, killing was accelerated. Nothing was allowed to slow the flow. This was where the genocide crossed a critical threshold. It was no longer reactive. It was proactive, planned weeks, months in advance. The system anticipated resistance, breakdown, panic, and absorbed it. Violence was no longer spontaneous. It was calibrated. Inside the ghettos, fear became thick and suffocating. Notices appeared ordering assemblies. Jewish councils were forced to cooperate under threat of collective punishment. Families were told to prepare for relocation, to bring food for a journey, to pack lightly, to leave their homes unlocked. Globoknik understood the power of lies. Deception reduced chaos. Chaos slowed trains, and trains were the bloodstream of the operation. Every transport that departed on schedule was a victory. The camps themselves were kept deliberately small. This was not Auschwitz, with its sprawling infrastructure and labor economy. These places existed for one reason. People arrived. They were killed. Their bodies were disposed of. Their possessions were sorted. And the next transport arrived. The men who worked there rotated frequently. Alcohol was plentiful. Discipline was harsh but selective. Brutality was encouraged, but not recklessness. What mattered was speed, silence, completion. Globoknik rarely visited the camps himself. He did not need to. His presence was felt in the demands he issued and the consequences for failure. Commanders who slowed operations were replaced. Guards who lost control were punished. The system tolerated cruelty, but not inefficiency. As Operation Reinhard expanded, the disappearance of entire communities became impossible to ignore. Rail workers noticed trains that returned empty. Villagers smelled burning flesh. Ash settled on fields. And yet, the machinery continued, protected by fear and indifference. Within the SS, rivalry simmered. Other leaders wanted control. Resources were scarce. But Globoknik's results spoke louder than ambition. The numbers rose relentlessly. Hundreds of thousands killed in months. No shooting squads required. No mass graves to dig in open fields. The killings were faster, quieter, and devastatingly final. What made this phase so lethal was not innovation alone, but confidence. The perpetrators now believed they had solved the problem. They believed extermination could be completed within a finite time frame, that the Jewish presence in Poland could be erased entirely, leaving behind only empty houses and stolen goods. Globoknik's operation did not just kill people. It rewired the moral universe of those who ran it. Killing became a task, a shift, a quota, something you clocked in and out of. Responsibility dissolved into the structure. Everyone played a role, and no one claimed the whole. And as the months passed, the machinery grew bolder. Trains arrived from farther away. Ghettos were emptied with increasing speed. Entire districts vanished from census records. The men in charge no longer spoke of possibility. They spoke of completion. By the time Operation Reinhard reached full momentum, it had become the most efficient killing program the Nazi regime had ever created. Not because it was more brutal than what came before, but because it was optimized to remove humanity from the process entirely. Globoknik had taken the abstract vision of annihilation and turned it into an operational reality, one that ran day and night, one that did not require speeches or rallies, one that functioned quietly, relentlessly, until there was nothing left to process. And yet, even as the system appeared unstoppable, cracks were already forming beneath the surface. The speed that made Operation Reinhard so deadly also made it fragile. The secrecy that protected it also isolated it. The violence that powered it generated desperation among those who had nothing left to lose. The camps were running at full capacity now. The trains were arriving faster. The ghettos were nearly emptied. And in the forests of occupied Poland, places were being prepared where the truth of what had happened would soon fight its way back into the open. Through fire, through revolt, through blood. The machinery had reached its peak. And that was when the first sparks of resistance began to flicker in the shadows. The doors were locked from the outside. Inside the room, the air was already growing warm, heavy with breath and fear. Some pressed their hands against the walls, feeling the smooth paint beneath their fingers, still believing this was a medical procedure, still trusting the men in white coats who had spoken softly and avoided eye contact. Then the engine started, a low mechanical rumble. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then dizziness, panic, the sound of bodies collapsing against one another. Within minutes, the room fell silent. This was not happening in Poland. It was not happening on the Eastern Front. It was happening inside Germany itself, years before Operation Reinhard would ever be named. Long before the ghettos were liquidated and the trains ran without pause, the Nazi regime had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They called it mercy. The program began quietly, almost experimentally. Disabled children were the first. Doctors filled out forms. Diagnoses were reduced to check marks. Parents were told their sons and daughters would receive special care. Instead, the children were transferred to institutions where death came through starvation, injections, or gas. Death certificates listed pneumonia, heart failure, natural causes. The lies were methodical. So was the killing. This was Action T4. What mattered was not ideology alone, but method. The regime was learning how to kill without chaos, how to do it indoors, how to control the environment. They tested gas. They tested secrecy. They tested how much the public would tolerate before rumors became dangerous. When protests emerged, when whispers reached churches and neighborhoods, the program was officially halted. But nothing truly stopped. It went underground. The personnel remained. The knowledge remained. And when the war expanded eastward, that knowledge became invaluable. The men who had run Action T4 were not dismissed or punished. They were reassigned. Their skills were too useful. They understood logistics. They understood deception. They knew how to build sealed rooms, how to operate engines that produced lethal exhaust, how to manage bodies afterward. Most importantly, they understood how to kill without forcing the perpetrators to look their victims in the eye. This was the missing piece that mass shootings could not provide. By the time Operation Reinhard was taking shape, the blueprint for industrialized murder already existed. It had been tested on German soil, refined through trial and error, and perfected behind closed doors. What changed now was scale and target. The victims would no longer be those the regime labeled as unproductive. They would be entire communities, entire cultures, entire histories. The transition was seamless. Former T4 staff arrived in occupied Poland under new titles, new orders, new secrecy oaths. Their past followed them like a shadow. They did not need to be told what was expected. They already knew how to design killing centers that appeared harmless from the outside, how to disguise gas chambers as showers, how to move people calmly toward their own deaths. The psychological distance mattered. Shooting required a decision every time a trigger was pulled. Gas did not. Once the door was sealed and the engine started, death became automatic. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. The killer became an operator, a technician. For the Nazi leadership, this was the solution they had been searching for since 1941. The Einsatzgruppen had proven ideological commitment. Action T4 provided technical expertise. Operation Reinhard would fuse the two into a single system, optimized for speed and silence. In occupied Poland, construction crews worked quickly, often under the supervision of men who had built killing facilities before. The buildings were crude by design. Wood instead of concrete. Minimal foundations. No unnecessary structures. Everything could be dismantled later. Nothing would remain to testify. The gas chambers themselves were deceptively simple. Engines scavenged from vehicles. Pipes leading into sealed rooms. No complex machinery. No expensive equipment. What mattered was reliability. Carbon monoxide was invisible. Odorless at first. Deadly within minutes. The victims would not understand what was happening until it was too late. Deception was essential. The T4 program had demonstrated this clearly. Calm reduced resistance. Routine reduced panic. So the language was softened. Signs were posted. Orders were given politely. Victims were told to undress for disinfection, to remember their clothing hooks, to move quickly for the sake of hygiene. Even the architecture played a role. Pathways were curved so nothing ahead could be seen clearly. Fences were disguised with branches. The final moments were hidden behind walls and doors. What made this phase so chilling was how ordinary it appeared to those running it. Men arrived for their shifts. They joked. They drank. They followed procedures. Death occurred on the other side of concrete and steel, out of sight, out of mind. The lessons of Action T4 extended beyond killing itself. Disposal had been a problem early on. Bodies piled up. Graves filled too quickly. But experience taught them how to burn corpses efficiently, how to crush bones, how to scatter ashes. Smoke was unavoidable, but it could be managed. Fires could be timed. Winds could be studied. The earth itself became part of the system. As Operation Reinhard accelerated, these methods were applied relentlessly. Bodies were no longer buried permanently. They were exhumed, burned, erased. The goal was not just death, but disappearance. A people reduced not even to graves, but to residue. Inside the ghettos, the change was felt almost immediately. Deportations increased in frequency. Entire neighborhoods were emptied overnight. The sick were no longer left behind. Children were no longer spared. This was not selection. It was removal. Those who had survived starvation and disease now faced something far worse. A system designed not to exploit them, but to end them completely. The Nazis understood that speed was essential. The longer people waited, the more they resisted. The more rumors spread. Action T4 had taught them that secrecy had limits. Operation Reinhard would move so fast that there would be no time for organized response. Trains arrived. Trains departed. Schedules tightened. The killing never paused. For the perpetrators, Action T4 had removed the last psychological barriers. They had already crossed the line between medicine and murder, between care and extermination. Now they applied that knowledge on a scale that dwarfed anything they had done before. This was not improvisation. It was inheritance. Each killing center was an evolution of what had come before. More efficient layouts, shorter distances between arrival and death, fewer opportunities for panic. Everything refined through experience. What was lost in the process was any remaining pretense of humanity. And yet, even as the system appeared perfected, it carried within it the seeds of its own exposure. Gas chambers required engines. Engines required fuel. Fires required smoke. Trains required witnesses. No matter how much secrecy was enforced, traces remained. Some guards drank themselves into stupors. Others boasted. Some victims survived long enough to escape. And everywhere, the land absorbed what human memory would later struggle to comprehend. The lessons of Action T4 had made Operation Reinhard possible. Without it, extermination on this scale could not have happened so quickly. It provided the tools, the personnel, and the psychological framework that turned ideology into industrial murder. By the time the camps were operating at full capacity, the line between past and present had vanished. What began as a domestic killing program had metastasized into a continental genocide. The machinery was running smoothly now, too smoothly. And as the smoke rose higher and the trains arrived faster, another realization began to take shape among the planners. Killing millions was possible, but erasing the evidence might be even harder. The system that Action T4 had birthed was powerful, but it was not invisible. And soon, the regime would begin to fear not just its victims, but the truth itself. The maps spread across the table did not show graves or gas chambers. They showed rail lines, rivers, forests, distances measured in hours instead of lives. Fingers traced routes in pencil, stopping at junctions where trains could slow without attracting attention, where sidings could be added quietly, where entire convoys could disappear from schedules without raising questions. To the men studying them, this was not a landscape of villages and families. It was terrain. It was opportunity. It was the perfect place to make people vanish. Occupied Poland had become something unique inside the Nazi Empire. It was not annexed like Western territories, and it was not treated like a future colony. It was a holding zone, a dumping ground for populations the regime did not want, but had not yet fully destroyed. Jews from across Europe were pushed into its borders, packed into ghettos that were never designed to sustain life. The density alone was staggering. Millions confined within a space already ravaged by war, poverty, and deliberate neglect. This was where the question of extermination stopped being theoretical. The ghettos were collapsing under their own weight. Hunger hollowed faces. Disease spread through overcrowded rooms where entire families slept on floors slick with filth and sweat. The air smelled of rot, coal smoke, and uncollected waste. Corpses were dragged into streets and stacked against walls, waiting for carts that came less and less often. Survival had narrowed to instinct. Morality bent. Time lost meaning. German administrators complained endlessly, not out of sympathy, but frustration. Dead bodies slowed traffic. Starving people disrupted labor quotas. Epidemics threatened nearby German populations. The ghettos were becoming unstable, unpredictable, and unpredictability was unacceptable. The regime wanted finality. Poland offered what no other occupied territory could: distance from Germany's urban centers, vast rural spaces where few outsiders traveled, forests dense enough to swallow sound, fields wide enough to absorb smoke, villages that could be intimidated into silence, and most importantly, rail infrastructure already built to move enormous quantities of goods and people across long distances. Trains were the key. Every major ghetto was connected by rail. Warsaw, Lublin, Radom, Krakow, Lvov. Lines converged and branched like veins, carrying coal, weapons, troops, and now, human cargo. The victims did not need to be transported far. They only needed to be moved far enough to never return. This geography shaped everything that followed. The killing centers that would define Operation Reinhard were not placed at random. They were positioned near rail junctions, but far from large cities. Close enough for efficiency, isolated enough for secrecy. Each location balanced access and invisibility with chilling precision. The camps were not meant to dominate the landscape. They were meant to blend into it. Forests became walls. Branches were woven into fences to break sight lines. Dirt roads absorbed the sound of trucks and boots. Even the names of nearby villages were kept out of official correspondence. If questions were asked, answers were vague. A labor camp, a transit facility, a supply depot. Local populations were warned not to interfere. Those who did were punished swiftly and publicly. Fear to the rest. Unlike concentration camps elsewhere, these sites had no economic purpose. There were no factories, no workshops, no long-term prisoner barracks. Labor existed only to serve death, to unload trains, to drag bodies, to sort clothing, to burn remains. And even that labor was temporary. No one was meant to stay long enough to become a problem. This was extermination without pretense. The decision to centralize killing in occupied Poland solved multiple problems at once. It removed mass murder from the Reich itself, shielding German civilians from exposure. It concentrated victims in an area already devastated by war, where disappearance blended into chaos. And it allowed the regime to deploy its most radical solutions far from international observation. Distance created silence. Silence created permission. As planning accelerated, the ghettos were redefined. They were no longer spaces of containment. They became reservoirs, holding tanks for people whose fate had already been sealed. Deportations were no longer framed as temporary measures. They were endpoints disguised as journeys. Jewish councils were trapped in an impossible position, ordered to compile lists, to organize assemblies, to ensure order during deportations. Compliance might buy time. Resistance invited immediate death. Parents were forced to choose which child might survive another day. Elders were told to prepare the young for relocation they would never complete. The cruelty was deliberate. Fragmentation weakened resistance. Confusion smothered hope. Poland's geography also shaped the speed of killing. Short transport times meant fewer deaths en route, which meant fewer disruptions upon arrival. The victims arrived exhausted, disoriented, but alive. Alive long enough to walk. Alive long enough to obey. Alive long enough to be processed. Every detail was calculated. The camps themselves were designed for rapid throughput. There would be no bottlenecks, no pauses for reflection. Arrival areas were separated from killing zones. Belongings were collected immediately to reduce clutter. Victims were kept moving, always forward, always under the illusion of routine. From the moment a train stopped, the clock began ticking. What made this phase so devastating was how smoothly it integrated into existing structures. No dramatic shift was required. The ghettos already existed. The trains already ran. The police already enforced orders. Operation Reinhard simply redirected everything toward a single outcome. Death became a destination. As word of deportation spread, panic followed. Some tried to hide. Others bribed officials. A few attempted escape. But the geography that enabled extermination also constrained resistance. Borders were sealed. Countryside patrols intensified. Informants multiplied. Survival narrowed to moments stolen in attics, cellars, forests. Most never had the chance. Poland became the center not because it was uniquely hostile, but because it was uniquely useful. The regime had turned it into a laboratory of annihilation, where techniques could be tested, refined, and scaled without restraint. And the speed was accelerating. Within months, entire regions were emptied of Jewish life. Towns that had existed for centuries fell silent. Synagogues stood abandoned. Shops shuttered. Homes stripped of furniture and memories. What remained was absence, and the administrative satisfaction of completion. The planners believed they had found the perfect balance. Far enough to remain unseen. Close enough to remain efficient. Brutal enough to finish the task. Flexible enough to erase the evidence afterward. But geography cuts both ways. The same forests that hid the camps also hid witnesses. The same rail lines that carried victims also carried rumors. The same distance that shielded German cities allowed the truth to gestate beyond their control. For now, the machinery was unstoppable. The camps were nearly ready. The trains were scheduled. The ghettos were marked for liquidation. Occupied Poland had become the heart of a system designed to kill faster than memory could form. And soon, as the first transports rolled toward places that were never meant to exist, the geography of death would reveal its most terrifying feature of all. Once you entered it, there was nowhere left to go. The first transport arrived before dawn. The train slowed as it passed through mist that clung to the trees, the forest swallowing sound, until even the grinding of metal seemed distant and unreal. When it stopped, there was no station, no platform, no sign to mark where the people inside had been brought. Only a clearing carved out of woodland, guarded by men who did not introduce themselves and did not explain what came next. Orders were shouted. Doors were forced open. Light flooded in, and with it confusion, fear, and the sudden realization that whatever this place was, it had never been meant to be found. This was Bełżec. It existed almost entirely outside public awareness, even within the machinery of the Third Reich. There were no grand announcements, no photographs meant for propaganda. Its purpose was too naked, too final. Bełżec was not an evolution of earlier camps. It was a prototype, the first full expression of what Operation Reinhard was intended to become. Everything that followed would be measured against what happened here. The site had been chosen with care. A small railway spur branched off the main line between Lublin and Lwów, cutting through forests that muffled sound and blocked sight lines. The surrounding villages were sparse, poor, easily intimidated. There were no major roads nearby, no reason for outsiders to wander close. If smoke rose above the trees, it could be explained away. If screams carried on the wind, they would dissolve into distance before reaching anyone who might question them. Construction was rushed, but deliberate. Wooden barracks rose quickly, flimsy structures designed to last just long enough to fulfill their purpose. Fences enclosed the area, camouflaged with branches to break the outline. Paths were laid out not for efficiency of movement alone, but for control of perception. Victims would see only what they were meant to see, and nothing more. There was no selection process here, no labor pool to be culled, no pretense of survival beyond a few hours. Bełżec was designed for one thing only: killing everyone who arrived. The men who ran it brought experience with them. Many had come directly from Action T4, already familiar with gas chambers, deception, and disposal. They knew how to speak calmly to terrified people, how to issue instructions that sounded routine, how to keep panic contained until it no longer mattered. When the first victims were unloaded, they were told they had arrived at a transit camp, that they would be disinfected before continuing their journey east. They were ordered to leave luggage behind, to undress for bathing. Signs reinforced the lie. The language was polite, almost bureaucratic. There was no shouting yet, no overt violence, only urgency. The gas chambers were hidden at the end of a narrow corridor locals later called the tube. High fences lined the path, blocking any view of what lay ahead. Guards stood close, weapons visible but rarely used. People were pushed forward by the weight of those behind them, by fear of falling out of line, by the simple momentum of a crowd that had nowhere else to go. Inside the chambers, the space was tight. The doors closed. The engine started. Carbon monoxide filled the room, colorless, invisible. At first, confusion. Then panic. Hands clawed at walls. Bodies pressed against one another as oxygen vanished. Within minutes, movement slowed, then stopped. Outside, the engine was turned off. Doors were opened. The work resumed. The bodies were dragged out, untangled, searched. Gold teeth were extracted. Hair was cut. Rings were pried from fingers that were still warm. The dead were not treated with haste or care, but with efficiency. Time mattered. Another transport was already scheduled. At first, bodies were buried in mass graves dug nearby. The soil absorbed blood quickly, but not completely. Rain loosened the earth. Gases build up beneath the surface, forcing corpses upward. The smell became impossible to ignore. Villagers complained. Guards drank more heavily. The earth itself seemed to resist what was being forced upon it. So the method changed. Bodies were exhumed and burned on open-air pyres constructed from railroad tracks and timber. Flames roared day and night. Smoke drifted across the forest, carrying a stench that settled into clothing and lungs. Ash fell like gray snow. Bones were crushed manually when the fires burned out, then scattered or reburied. The goal was no longer just death. It was erasure. Bełżec operated at a speed that shocked even those involved. Entire transports could be killed within hours of arrival. There were no pauses for registration, no delays for sorting prisoners into categories. Everyone was processed the same way. From train to death, the interval was brutally short. This speed was intentional. The designers of Operation Reinhard understood that hesitation bred resistance. Fear multiplied when people had time to think. At Bełżec, there was no time. The victims were overwhelmed by noise, orders, movement. They were kept off balance until the end. The psychological toll on the perpetrators was mitigated by distance and routine. Guards rarely saw the moment of death. Operators managed engines. Others handled bodies after life had already left them. Tasks were divided, compartmentalized. Responsibility blurred. Alcohol filled the gaps. Few survivors emerged from Bełżec. Those selected for temporary labor were killed once their strength failed. Witnesses were liabilities. The camp was designed to leave no one behind who could speak later. By the end of its operation, hundreds of thousands had been murdered there. Entire communities from southeastern Poland vanished into smoke and ash. And yet, Bełżec remained largely unknown, even as it functioned at full capacity. It did not loom over history the way Auschwitz would. It was too efficient, too quiet. The camp's success, measured in death, shaped everything that followed. Its layout, its procedures, its brutal simplicity became the template for other killing centers. Sobibór and Treblinka would refine the process, increase capacity, correct flaws. But Bełżec was where the concept proved itself. This was the moment Operation Reinhard crossed from planning into irreversible reality. As months passed, transports arrived more frequently. Ghettos were emptied with growing speed. The machinery adjusted seamlessly, absorbing each new wave of victims without pause. There was no sense of climax, no dramatic turning point. Just repetition, arrival, death, disposal. And because Bełżec was never meant to be seen, it was never meant to be remembered. When its task was complete, the camp was dismantled. Barracks torn down. Fences removed. The ground leveled. Trees planted. A farmhouse built to disguise the scar beneath. Guards were reassigned or killed. Paperwork destroyed. The forest reclaimed the space. But the lessons learned there did not vanish. They were carried forward, applied elsewhere with devastating effect. Bełżec had demonstrated that extermination could be industrialized completely, that murder could be reduced to a schedule, that entire populations could disappear without leaving visible traces. It had shown that genocide did not require chaos, only planning. And as the final fires burned low and the last ashes were scattered into the soil, the men who ran Operation Reinhard did not slow down. They looked north. They looked west. They looked toward camps still under construction, toward systems not yet fully tested. Bełżec was finished. What came next would be larger, more complex, and far harder to conceal. And the trains were already on their way. The forest closed in again as the road narrowed, trees pressing close enough that branches brushed against passing trucks. The air smelled damp, heavy with pine and decay, the kind of place where sound dies quickly and footsteps feel swallowed the moment they leave the ground. There was no town nearby, no visible reason for anyone to come here by accident. That was the point. This place was meant to exist just beyond curiosity, just far enough from the world that what happened inside could pretend to be invisible. Sobibór was built with Bełżec in mind, but not as a copy. It was a correction. The men who designed it had already learned where the prototype failed. They had seen the problems caused by mass graves, The danger of smoke rising too openly, the psychological strain that came from chaos when transport arrived too quickly. Sobibór would be quieter, more controlled, more disciplined. It would not rush death at the cost of order. It would pace it, regulate it, smooth the edges until extermination felt routine. From the outside, Sobibór looked almost ordinary. A cluster of wooden buildings hidden behind fences woven with branches. A rail spur that disappeared into trees. Guard towers that blended into the forest canopy rather than dominating it. Even the name was rarely spoken beyond official channels. Maps were vague. Directions were imprecise. If someone asked questions, the answers were deliberately dull. Inside, everything was carefully divided. The camp was split into zones, each isolated from the others, so no one could ever grasp the whole. The arrival area, the undressing barracks, the killing zone, the burial and burning grounds. Workers moved between them only when ordered, only when necessary. Knowledge itself was treated as a threat. When the first transports arrived, the procedure unfolded with mechanical calm. Doors slid open. Guards shouted instructions that sounded practiced, almost bored. People were told they had reached a labor camp, that showers were required before assignment, that their belongings would be returned afterward. The lie was reinforced by details. Numbers on hooks, benches to sit on, signs painted neatly in German and Polish. Deception was not an accessory here. It was the foundation. Victims were kept moving at a steady pace, not rushed enough to panic, not slow enough to ask questions. The pathway leading to the gas chambers curved deliberately, blocking any direct view of what waited ahead. High fences lined with branches created a tunnel that funneled people forward, separating them from everything they had just left behind. The forest pressed close on both sides, silent, indifferent. The gas chambers themselves were small, functional, disguised as bathhouses. Once inside, the doors closed tightly. An engine started. Carbon monoxide filled the space, invisible and relentless. Screams erupted, then faded. In minutes, it was over. Outside, the routine resumed. Bodies were dragged out and searched quickly. Gold teeth removed. Haircut. Clothing sorted into piles that grew larger with every transport. The dead were carried away to pits or pyres, depending on the phase of operations. Nothing was wasted. Everything was catalogued, redistributed, absorbed into the machinery of the Reich. Sobibór was designed not only to kill, but to sustain killing over time. A small group of prisoners was selected to perform labor tasks. They unloaded trains, cleaned barracks, handled bodies. They lived under constant threat, beaten without warning, executed for minor infractions. Their survival was temporary by design. Once their strength failed, they were replaced by new arrivals. The guards enforced discipline ruthlessly, but with a purpose that went beyond cruelty. Random violence was discouraged if it disrupted the schedule. Order mattered more than rage. Sobibór was not meant to vent hatred. It was meant to process death efficiently, day after day. The forest helped maintain the illusion of isolation. Sound rarely carried far. Smoke filtered through branches and dissipated before it could draw attention. Locals knew something terrible was happening, but fear kept them silent. To ask questions was to invite punishment. To look too closely was to disappear. And yet, even here, whispers traveled. Among the prisoners forced to work inside the camp, understanding grew slowly, painfully. People noticed that no one ever returned from the showers, that transports arrived full and departed empty, that the smoke never truly stopped. Survival brought clarity that ignorance could not. Sobibór was quieter than Bełżec, but it was not gentler. Children arrived, clinging to parents. Elderly people struggled to keep up as guards shouted. The ground beneath bare feet felt cold, uneven. The air smelled of sap and burning flesh, though the source was never visible from where the victims stood. Many sensed the truth in fragments, through a scream cut short, through a glance exchanged between guards, through the absence of anyone waiting on the other side. But fear, exhaustion, and the hope that this moment might still be something else kept most moving forward. The camp command believed they had perfected the system. Killing proceeded smoothly. Transports were processed quickly. Resistance appeared impossible. The forest enclosed everything like a lid. They were wrong. What they did not anticipate was how knowledge, once gained, could transform despair into resolve. Among the forced laborers, plans began to form. Quietly, carefully, over months. The understanding was simple and brutal. No one survived Sobibór by obedience alone. Death was inevitable. The only question was how it would come. This realization stripped fear of its power. Weapons were scarce. Trust was dangerous. A single informant could doom everyone. But desperation sharpened thought. Prisoners observed guard routines, counted steps, memorized schedules. They noticed which officers carried pistols, which drank heavily, which could be lured into isolated buildings. The forest that hid the camp could also hide escape. As Operation Reinhard continued, Sobibór became a machine that appeared flawless from above. Numbers flowed upward. Reports spoke of progress, of efficiency, of completion approaching. Entire regions were declared cleared of Jews. The system was working as intended. But inside the camp, beneath the routine and terror, something else was building. A fragile alliance among men who knew they would not live long enough to see the end of the war, but who refused to disappear without a trace. The camp's very structure created opportunity. Its zones, meant to isolate knowledge, also isolated guards. Its routines, meant to impose order, created predictability. Its confidence bred complacency. The planners of Operation Reinhard had believed that fear alone could sustain obedience forever. Sobibór would prove them wrong. As summer turned to autumn, the pace of killing remained relentless. Transports arrived from farther away. The labor units were worked harder, beaten more frequently, replaced more quickly. Smoke drifted through the trees almost constantly now, settling into the camp like a permanent haze. Time felt distorted. Days blurred together. Life narrowed to survival measured in hours. And yet, beneath the ash and terror, the idea took root that death did not have to be silent. The forest had swallowed countless screams already. Soon, it would hear something different. Soon, Sobibór would become the place where the machinery of Operation Reinhard encountered something it was never designed to handle. Defiance. The train screamed as it braked, metal grinding against metal, a sound so sharp it seemed to tear through the forest itself. Inside the packed freight cars, people were already collapsing from heat, thirst, and panic. Some had been standing for days without air, pressed so tightly together they could barely lift their arms. When the doors finally slid open, sunlight poured in like an accusation, blinding and merciless. Shouts followed immediately. Dogs barked. Rifle butts slammed against wood. The ground outside looked ordinary, sand, trees, sky, but the smell was raw. Sweet, burnt, heavy. Something in the air told the truth long before words ever could. This was Treblinka. Unlike Bełżec and Sobibór, Treblinka was not hidden deep in remote forest. It sat close enough to a village that trains could arrive constantly, close enough to Warsaw that deportations could be carried out with terrifying speed. And that was precisely why it existed. Treblinka was built for volume, for velocity, for annihilation on a scale that dwarfed everything that had come before. By the summer of 1942, the Warsaw Ghetto was bursting at the seams. Nearly 500,000 people had been sealed inside its walls, starving under deliberate conditions meant to weaken and break them. Disease spread unchecked. Corpses lay in streets. German authorities no longer wanted to manage the problem. They wanted to erase it. Treblinka was the answer. The camp was constructed in haste, because haste itself was part of the plan. Wooden buildings, minimal infrastructure, a single rail spur branching off the main line. No attempt at permanence. The intention was never to maintain Treblinka as an institution. It was to burn through people as fast as trains could deliver them. From the moment transports began arriving from Warsaw, Treblinka operated at a pace that stunned even seasoned perpetrators. Entire trainloads were murdered within hours. The camp commanders did not aim for order. They aimed for throughput. Panic was not a failure here. Panic accelerated the process. Victims were driven from the cars with whips, rifle butts, screams. Families were torn apart instantly. The elderly were beaten for slowing down. Children were ripped from arms and hurled forward. There was no effort to calm, no pretense of care. The lie of resettlement barely mattered anymore. Most people sensed immediately that they had arrived at the end. Still, instinct forced them to obey. They were herded toward a fake station area, complete with a clock that never told the correct time. Signs pointed toward showers. Orders were barked rapidly, leaving no room for thought. The ground burned under bare feet. Dust filled mouths and lungs. The smell of death thickened with every step. The path to the gas chambers was known by the guards as the Schlouch, the tube. A narrow corridor fenced on both sides, lined with branches to block sight lines, forcing people forward in a compressed mass. There was no turning back. Those who fell were trampled. Those who resisted were shot on the spot and dragged aside, their bodies tossed onto growing piles that no one pretended not to see. Inside the chambers, engines roared to life. Carbon monoxide poured in. Death came quickly, violently, without dignity. Screams slammed against sealed doors until oxygen vanished and silence followed. Then the next transport arrived. Treblinka was overwhelmed almost from the start. The scale of deportations from Warsaw exceeded expectations. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Mass graves filled, collapsed, overflowed. The ground split open. Blood seeped into sand. The stench drifted for miles, impossible to contain. The camp responded by adapting, not slowing. Bodies were exhumed and burned in massive open-air pyres built from railway tracks. Flames roared day and night. Smoke darkened the sky. Ash settled on nearby villages, coating roofs, fields, skin. Locals knew. Everyone knew. Fear kept mouths shut. Inside the camp, brutality escalated. Guards drank heavily, beat prisoners without provocation, killed for amusement. Sadism thrived where order collapsed. Treblinka was not controlled like Sobibór. It was raw, violent, unrestrained. A place where extermination consumed even its operators. And yet, the killing never stopped. By some estimates, hundreds of thousands were murdered there in a matter of weeks. Entire transports from Warsaw vanished in a single day. The camp processed human beings faster than any killing center before or after it, except Auschwitz at its peak. Those forced to work inside Treblinka lived in a state of constant terror. Their tasks were unbearable, sorting clothing still warm from bodies, pulling gold teeth from mouths frozen open in death, dragging corpses that included neighbors, friends, family. Their survival depended on obedience, but obedience offered no protection. Executions were arbitrary. A glance, a pause, a stumble, and it could mean death. And yet, within this chaos, something unexpected happened. Unlike Bełżec, Treblinka did not succeed in erasing all witnesses. The camp's disorder, its reliance on sheer speed, created cracks. Prisoners lived long enough to understand exactly where they were, long enough to see patterns, long enough to realize that no one ever left alive. That knowledge changed everything. By late 1942, whispers of revolt began to circulate among the forced laborers. Quiet conversations held in shadows. Plans spoken in fragments, then abandoned, then revived. The understanding was universal. Death was certain. The only choice was how to meet it. Weapons were scarce. Hope was thinner still. But desperation sharpened resolve. They watched guards carefully, learned routines, counted steps, noted which officers drank too much, which wandered alone, which carried keys. They stole pistols and grenades when they could, hiding them in sand, beneath barracks, inside corpses if necessary. The plan that emerged was simple and suicidal. Kill as many guards as possible. Set buildings on fire. Create chaos. Escape into the forest. On the 2nd of August, 1943, the plan was set in motion. Shots rang out. Explosions followed. Barracks burned. Smoke engulfed the camp. Prisoners rushed fences under gunfire, cutting through wire with stolen tools, climbing over bodies, running into fields and woods as bullets tore through the air. Many were killed immediately. Others were hunted down in the days that followed. But some survived. Enough. Treblinka, the place designed to leave no witnesses, had failed. The revolt did not stop Operation Reinhard. It did not save the millions already murdered. But it shattered the illusion of total control. It proved that even in a place built entirely for death, resistance was possible. After the uprising, the camp was dismantled quickly. Barracks torn down, gas chambers destroyed, the ground leveled, a farmhouse built over the ashes, trees planted to disguise the scar. Treblinka vanished from the landscape, but it did not vanish from history. The speed that made Treblinka so lethal also made it unstable. The brutality that powered it also fueled rebellion. And as news of the revolt spread quietly through occupied Poland, the architects of Operation Reinhard faced an uncomfortable truth. The system was efficient. It was deadly, but was not invisible. The smoke could be hidden. The buildings could be erased. The land could be replanted. But memory had escaped the forest. And with Treblinka's destruction, Operation Reinhard entered its final, most dangerous phase. One where the killers would begin to fear exposure almost as much as their victims had once feared death. The doors slammed, shut with a sound that echoed long after the train began to move, a hollow metallic finality that left no room for doubt. Inside the freight car, darkness pressed in immediately. There were no seats, no windows, no air vents large enough to matter. People stood packed shoulder to shoulder, bodies pressed so tightly together that turning one's head became a struggle. Somewhere, a child began to cry. Somewhere else, a voice whispered a prayer. The wheels jolted forward, and with the first violent lurch of motion, the last connection to the life they had known snapped cleanly away. For most of the victims of Operation Reinhard, this was the final stage they would consciously remember. Not the camps, not the chambers. The journey itself became the boundary between life and annihilation. The deportations began with paperwork, notices posted on walls, orders read aloud in courtyards. Jewish councils summoned and commanded to cooperate under threat of collective punishment. Lists were demanded, quotas set. Entire neighborhoods were assigned dates and times, down to the hour. Families were instructed to pack lightly, to bring food for several days, to label their luggage carefully with names and addresses, because they would need it again after resettlement. The lie was deliberate and refined. People were told they were being sent to labor camps, to agricultural settlements in the east, to places where work was plentiful and conditions would be better than the ghettos they were leaving behind. The deception was reinforced by detail. Rail tickets were issued. Doctors were present at assemblies. Baggage was inspected, not confiscated outright. Normality was staged carefully, because normality prevented panic. And panic slowed the process. The ghettos had already broken people down. Starvation made resistance physically difficult. Disease drained strength and clarity. Years of humiliation taught compliance as a survival strategy. When orders came, many obeyed not because they believed them, but because disobedience felt impossible. On deportation days, streets filled with people carrying bundles, suitcases, sacks tied with string. The sound of footsteps merged with crying, shouting, barking dogs. German police and auxiliary forces lined the routes, weapons visible, expressions bored or irritated. Anyone who collapsed was beaten. Anyone who resisted was shot publicly, their bodies left behind as warnings. At the collection points, chaos was contained through speed. Names were checked. Groups were pushed forward. Children clung to parents. The elderly lagged behind, gasping for breath. There were no explanations, only commands. The faster people moved, the less they could think. Trains waited. The freight cars were never meant for human transport. They had once carried cattle, coal, timber. Now they were repurposed to carry people marked for death. Dozens were forced inside each car, sometimes more than 100. The doors were slammed shut, the bolts drawn, and the train moved on. Inside, time distorted almost immediately. Air vanished. Heat built rapidly as bodies pressed together. The smell of sweat, fear, and excrement thickened until it was impossible to breathe without gagging. Some tried to sit, but there was no room. Others fainted and fell, trampled by the press of bodies that had nowhere to go. Water was non-existent. Children screamed until their voices gave out. Adults fought to keep them upright, to keep them alive, knowing nothing about what waited at the end of the journey. The trips lasted hours, sometimes days. When the train stopped, it was rarely explained why. Engines idled. Doors remained closed. People screamed for air. Some died before the journey ended. Their bodies remained upright, pinned in place by the living, who could not lower them even if they tried. This was not accidental cruelty. It was calculated. Dead bodies reduced resistance upon arrival. Exhausted survivors were easier to control. Confusion prevented coordination. By the time the doors opened, most people were no longer capable of organized thought. When the train finally stopped for good, the doors were thrown open violently. Light flooded in. Guards shouted. Dogs lunged. The sudden contrast between darkness and daylight disoriented everyone. Those who did not move fast enough were beaten or shot. Bodies were dragged out and tossed aside without ceremony. From that moment on, time accelerated brutally. Victims were herded into lines. Orders came rapidly, often in languages they barely understood. Luggage was taken and piled neatly, reinforcing the illusion that it would be returned. Papers were ignored. Names no longer mattered. People were reduced to motion. Families were torn apart without explanation. Men pushed one way, women and children another. Mothers screamed as children were ripped from their arms. Elderly parents disappeared into crowds they would never see again. There was no pause to grieve. The pace was relentless. The camps were designed so that nothing beyond the immediate surroundings could be seen. Fences were high. Branches obscured views. Pathways curved sharply. Every step forward erased the one before it. People sensed something was wrong, but could not grasp the whole picture. This was the most critical moment in the system. The victims were still alive, still capable of fear, of resistance, of chaos. And so the deception intensified. Guards shouted about showers, about disinfection, about work assignments. Signs reinforced the lie. The presence of doctors, even fake ones, reassured some. The routine of undressing suggested hygiene, not death. Clothing was removed quickly. Shoes were tied together. Valuables handed over. Hair was sometimes cut. The air felt colder now. The vulnerability was total. And still, many clung to the belief that this humiliation was temporary, that it would end with survival. Those who realized the truth often did so too late. The path to the gas chambers was engineered to prevent hesitation. Narrow corridors forced people forward. Crowds pushed from behind eliminated the possibility of stopping. Guards positioned themselves to strike down anyone who resisted. The noise of engines masked screams ahead. The dead were invisible to the living until the final moment. Inside the chambers, everything ended. For the vast majority of victims, there was no record of death, no registration, no grave, no marker. Their existence ceased within minutes of arrival. Their bodies were processed, burned, scattered. Their names vanished from documents. Their homes were emptied. Their possessions redistributed. The world moved on as if they had never been there. Operation Reinhard was designed to make disappearance absolute. And yet, fragments survived. A child who escaped during transport and hid in fields. A laborer who survived long enough to flee a camp during chaos. A railway worker who witnessed trains arriving full and leaving empty. A villager who smelled burning flesh for months and could not forget it. Memories slipped through cracks the system could not seal. Inside the ghettos still standing, knowledge spread slowly. People spoke in whispers, about places where no one returned from, about smoke rising from forests, about camps that were not camps at all. Some refused to believe it. Others believed and felt the suffocation of waiting for a fate they could not escape. Resistance took many forms. Hiding children, forging papers, smuggling food, joining underground networks. Some took up arms. Most could not. The machinery was too vast. The control too total. The choices too cruel. By the time Operation Reinhard reached its peak, entire regions had been emptied of Jewish life. Languages fell silent. Traditions vanished. Communities that had existed for centuries were erased in months. The deportation trains kept running, their schedules tight, their purpose unquestioned. What made this phase so devastating was not just the violence, but the efficiency with which victims were isolated from one another. Families separated, communities broken into fragments, knowledge fragmented, panic contained. The system thrived on isolation. Each transport felt like a singular tragedy, disconnected from the next. Victims rarely understood they were part of a mass operation until it was too late. The absence of information became a weapon as powerful as any gun. And yet, even in this darkness, humanity persisted in moments that defied the machinery. A mother whispering a lullaby in a freight car. A stranger sharing the last drop of water. A prayer spoken aloud despite the risk. A final embrace stolen in the chaos of arrival. These moments did not stop death, but they resisted erasure. As the months passed and the deportations intensified, the planners of Operation Reinhard believed they were approaching completion. Ghettos were cleared. Trains ran on time. Camps operated at capacity. Numbers rose with terrifying speed. But beneath the apparent success, pressure was building. The sheer scale of disappearance drew attention. Rumors crossed borders. Resistance movements gathered evidence. Survivors began to speak. Revolts ignited inside camps, thought unassailable. The machinery that depended on secrecy began to crack under its own weight. The victims had been reduced to cargo, to numbers, to smoke. But memory was not so easily destroyed. And as Operation Reinhard consumed the last of the ghettos, the system faced a new challenge. How to erase not just the people it had murdered, but the proof that they had ever existed at all. The killing had been fast. The forgetting would be much harder. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of fabric sliding against fabric. Coats, dresses, shoes, prayer shawls, children's sweaters. Layer after layer was lifted, sorted, folded, stacked. Hands moved quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. Nothing here smelled of death yet. It smelled of wool, leather, sweat, cheap soap, damp cloth. It smelled like homes, like streets, like lives interrupted mid-sentence. This was the other half of Operation Reinhard, the part that did not scream. From the very beginning, extermination and theft were inseparable. The murder of millions was not only ideological, it was economic. Every transport that arrived carried not just human beings, but property, clothing, money, jewelry, watches, glasses, gold teeth, wedding rings, hair. Even the bodies themselves were stripped for value. Nothing was considered sacred. Nothing was allowed to remain with the dead. The system was designed so that robbery happened before the victims fully understood what was happening to them. Deception served a second purpose here. Calm victims surrendered belongings more completely. Panic led to hidden valuables, swallowed jewelry, items lost or destroyed. Efficiency demanded compliance, and so the lie continued right up to the edge of death. At arrival areas, victims were ordered to leave luggage behind neatly, told it would be returned after disinfection. Signs reinforced the illusion. Clerks stood nearby. Numbers were assigned to piles, not to people. Every suitcase was a container of value, waiting to be harvested. Once clothing was removed, the final stripping began. Rings were pulled from fingers. Necklaces lifted from skin. Earrings torn loose. Gold teeth were marked for extraction later. Once death made resistance impossible. Even hair was collected, cut from heads before or after death, bundled, shipped, reused for industrial purposes. This was not improvisation. It was policy. Operation Reinhard had its own accounting offices. Clerks tallied shipments. Weights were measured. Inventories compiled. The murdered were transformed into statistics, not just of death, but of profit. Reports moved upward through the SS bureaucracy, detailing how much had been collected, how efficiently, how quickly. Gold flowed into the Reich's coffers. Foreign currency was exchanged. Jewelry was melted down. Clothing was disinfected and redistributed to German civilians bombed out of their homes or sent to settlers in occupied territories. Shoes were paired and stacked in warehouses by the tens of thousands, soles worn thin by lives that ended barefoot on concrete floors. The irony was grotesque. People were murdered as enemies of the state. Then their possessions were absorbed seamlessly into the economy of that same state. Inside the camps, forced labor units handled the work. Jewish prisoners were compelled to sort the belongings of those who had arrived only hours earlier. Children's clothes, family photographs tucked into pockets, letters never sent, keys to apartments that no longer existed. The laborers recognized names written on tags. Sometimes they recognized handwriting. Sometimes they recognized the smell of a familiar home. They were beaten if they slowed down, executed if they tried to hide anything. Their labor was temporary, their fate already sealed. They were tools used to extract value before being discarded themselves. The process was relentless. As transports increased, sorting barracks overflowed. Mountains of shoes grew taller than men. Piles of clothing stretched from wall to wall. The sheer volume was staggering, undeniable evidence of the scale of killing even as the regime tried to conceal it. And yet, the system adapted. Warehouses were expanded. Additional labor units assigned. Transport schedules adjusted to move goods out as fast as they arrived. The flow of stolen property became as critical as the flow of trains bringing victims in. Any bottleneck threatened efficiency. This was extermination as an industrial supply chain. The economic logic reinforced the killing. The more people murdered, the more resources extracted. The more efficiently they were processed, the smoother the system ran. Moral restraint had no place here. Only output mattered. Even death itself was mined. Gold teeth were extracted after gassing, sometimes while bodies were still warm. Bone fragments were crushed after cremation to remove any remaining valuables. Ashes were sifted carefully. Nothing was allowed to escape collection. The planners of Operation Reinhard understood something chillingly pragmatic. Dead people could not complain. They could not reclaim property. They could not testify. Once erased, their belongings became unclaimed assets, absorbed into a state that denied their humanity even in death. This theft extended beyond material goods. Homes left behind were seized. Furniture redistributed. Businesses reassigned. Entire neighborhoods emptied and repurposed. Jewish presence was not just destroyed, it was replaced. In occupied Poland, German settlers moved into houses still warm from departure. Shops reopened under new ownership. Streets were renamed. Cemeteries were desecrated or paved over. The landscape itself was restructured to reflect the absence of those who had lived there for centuries. The speed of Operation Reinhard made this possible. There was no time for legal disputes, no survivors left to contest ownership. The system moved faster than memory. And yet, the accumulation of stolen goods created its own problems. The sheer quantity attracted attention. Rail workers noticed shipments that did not align with official explanations. Clerks handled valuables with no clear origin. Civilians received clothing still marked with foreign names. Questions were whispered, if not asked aloud. Inside the SS, corruption flourished. Guards stole jewelry for themselves. Officers pocketed currency. Black markets emerged around extermination camps. The leadership tolerated some theft, but punished excess, not for moral reasons, but because it threatened discipline and secrecy. Even mass murder required regulation. The paradox deepened. A regime obsessed with order had created an economy built on chaos and plunder. Killing was meant to erase evidence. Yet the goods left behind became physical proof that millions had existed and vanished. Warehouses filled faster than they could be emptied. Shoes piled up endlessly, mute testimony to the scale of annihilation. Clothing retained the shape of bodies that would never wear them again. The dead were invisible, but their absence was material, tangible, impossible to fully disguise. For the forced laborers, this phase was often more psychologically devastating than handling bodies. Death was abstract. Property was intimate. A sweater carried warmth. A prayer book carried fingerprints. A child's shoe carried a life abruptly ended. Sorting meant remembering. Some laborers hid notes inside clothing. Others memorized names. A few managed to smuggle evidence out. Numbers, descriptions, fragments of truth that would later surface in testimonies. These acts were tiny, dangerous, and rarely successful, but they represented defiance against total erasure. The planners of Operation Reinhard believed that once people were dead, history would end with them. They underestimated the persistence of objects, how possessions could outlast owners, how material traces could speak when voices were silenced. As the operation progressed, the economic machinery ran at full capacity. Reports boasted of efficiency, of value recovered, of success measured not just in bodies, but in kilograms of gold and tons of textiles. The language was cold, sanitized, proud. The murder of millions was being celebrated as administrative achievement, but the system was beginning to strain. Warehouses overflowed. Smoke drew attention. Revolts shattered illusions of control. Survivors escaped and spoke. The very scale that made Operation Reinhard effective also made it impossible to fully conceal. The stolen goods told a story that the regime could not fully suppress. Each shoe, each coat, each ring represented a life erased, but not forgotten. A life that had left something behind. And as the killing continued, the planners faced a new urgency. It was no longer enough to murder efficiently. They now had to erase the evidence of murder itself. Bodies, camps, records, goods, memories. The theft had been thorough. The forgetting would need to be even more ruthless. And so Operation Reinhard entered its final phase. Not just the extermination of people, but the attempted extermination of truth itself. The knife was hidden beneath a workbench, wrapped in cloth darkened by grease and blood. It had taken weeks to steal, weeks to keep it concealed, weeks to pass it silently from hand to hand without being seen. Possession of it meant death. Discovery meant torture before death. But for the men who knew it was there, the blade represented something more dangerous to the camp than any weapon the guards carried. It represented choice. Inside the extermination camps of Operation Reinhard, survival was never meant to be permanent. From the moment prisoners were selected for labor, their lives were already measured in weeks or months. They unloaded trains, sorted clothing, burned bodies, cleaned blood from floors. They learned the rhythm of murder so intimately that they could predict it by sound alone. Engines starting, doors slamming, silence falling. They lived inside death long enough to understand that obedience would not save them. This knowledge changed everything. At first, resistance seemed unthinkable. The camps were designed to crush initiative. Prisoners were starved deliberately, beaten randomly, executed publicly for the smallest infractions. Informers were everywhere, real or imagined. The guards controlled weapons, food, movement, information. Any act of defiance appeared suicidal. But certainty of death has a way of sharpening resolve. In Sobibór, whispers began months before anyone dared to speak aloud. Men compared notes while working. Who disappeared and when? Which guards drank too much? Which paths were less watched? Which buildings could be entered alone? The realization came slowly, but inevitably. No one was ever released. No one was transferred. The only exit was smoke. Once that truth settled in, fear began to change shape. Despair gave way to calculation. If death was unavoidable, then timing mattered. Dying quietly meant erasure. Dying while fighting meant interruption. Noise. Witnesses. Chaos. Perhaps escape. The idea was not to win. It was to rupture the machine. In Sobibór, leadership emerged organically. Prisoners with military experience, organizational skill, or simply the trust of others began to coordinate. Plans were fragile, constantly revised. Weapons were almost non-existent. Axes stolen from workshops, knives smuggled from kitchens, a few pistols taken from careless guards, hidden at enormous risk. The strategy relied on deception, the same tool the camp itself used. Guards would be lured into workshops under pretext of inspecting goods or collecting valuables. There, they would be killed silently. One by one, their weapons seized, their absence unnoticed until it was too late. Timing was everything. On the afternoon of October 14, 1943, the plan was set in motion. Prisoners moved with forced calm. The camp followed its routine. Guards entered workshops alone, confident in their authority, unaware they were walking into traps. The first guard was struck from behind, killed almost instantly. His body was hidden. His weapon passed along. Then another, and another. Within hours, multiple SS men lay dead, their power stripped away quietly. But perfection was impossible. An alarm was raised prematurely. Shots rang out. Panic spread. The camp erupted into chaos. Prisoners ran toward the fences, cutting wire, climbing over bodies, sprinting into minefields and forests under machine gun fire. Many were killed instantly. Others fell to hidden explosives. Some were hunted down in the days that followed. But some escaped. Sobibór had been breached. For the first time, an extermination camp designed to leave no witnesses had failed completely. Survivors reached the outside world. They spoke. They testified. They named names. They described processes. The illusion of total secrecy was shattered. At Treblinka, the dynamic was different, but no less desperate. The camp's brutality was more chaotic, its guards more sadistic, its control less disciplined. Prisoners were worked to exhaustion, killed arbitrarily, replaced constantly. And yet, here too, knowledge accumulated. The labor units at Treblinka understood their fate with terrifying clarity. They watched transports arrive endlessly, watched smoke rise without pause, watched bodies burn day and night. They knew there would be no liberation, no rescue, no mercy. In this environment, resistance did not grow from hope, but from rage. Weapons were stolen piece by piece. A grenade hidden in sand. A pistol slipped from a guard's belt. Ammunition scavenged and hoarded. Plans were drawn in dirt, erased, redrawn. Trust was tested constantly. One betrayal would doom everyone. On August 2nd, 1943, the prisoners acted. Buildings were set on fire. Shots echoed across the camp. Prisoners stormed the armory. Guards were attacked. Fences were cut. Hundreds ran for the surrounding fields and forests as bullets tore through the air. Many were gunned down immediately. Others were captured later. But dozens survived long enough to tell the world what Treblinka truly was. The camp was never the same afterward. Within weeks, Treblinka was dismantled. Gas chambers destroyed. Barracks torn down. The land leveled. A farmhouse built to disguise the scar. The very speed of its operation had made it vulnerable. It had burned too brightly, too violently, to remain hidden forever. Even in places where large-scale revolts were impossible, resistance took other forms. Prisoners sabotaged equipment, deliberately slowed work, miscounted inventories, hid evidence inside clothing, whispered warnings to new arrivals when guards were distracted. Some chose suicide rather than cooperation, denying the camp their labor. In ghettos still standing, armed resistance grew as knowledge of the camp spread. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was not a direct part of Operation Reinhard, but it was fueled by its reality. People fought not to survive, but to die on their own terms. These acts did not stop the genocide. They did not save the millions already murdered, but they changed the psychological balance. For the perpetrators, certainty fractured. The camps had been built on the assumption that victims would remain passive until death. That fear would always outweigh defiance. Sobibór and Treblinka proved that assumption wrong. Desperation could become weaponized. Knowledge could ignite rebellion. The response was immediate and brutal. Security tightened. Labor units were rotated more frequently. Witnesses were killed faster. Camps were dismantled sooner. Operation Reinhard shifted from maximum efficiency to damage control. The killers had learned something they had not anticipated. Extermination produced resistance as surely as it produced corpses, and resistance produced memory. Every escaped prisoner carried a piece of truth. Every revolt generated rumors that crossed borders. Every gunshot fired inside a death camp echoed far beyond its fences. By late 1943, The leadership understood that Operation Reinhard could not continue indefinitely, not because the killing was unfinished, but because the risk of exposure had grown too great. The very efficiency that had defined the operation had created pressure points it could no longer contain. The machinery began to slow. Camps were dismantled, survivors hunted down, records destroyed. But the damage was already done. The silence had been broken. For the first time, the extermination camps were no longer just places of death. They were places of defiance, places where the victims had forced the world, however briefly, to look directly at what was happening. Operation Reinhard had been designed to erase people without trace. Resistance ensured that traces remained. And as the camps fell silent one by one, the men who had built the system turned their attention to a final, desperate task. Not killing, but forgetting. The fires burned long after the killing stopped. At night, the glow could be seen through the trees, low and steady, as if the earth itself were smoldering. By day, the smoke drifted thin and gray, settling into leaves, into clothing, into lungs. Men worked with shovels and hooks, their faces streaked with ash, their hands blistered and blackened. They did not speak unless ordered. They did not ask why. They already knew. The dead were coming back up. This was the moment the machinery turned inward, when extermination was no longer enough and erasure became the priority. For months, Operation Reinhard had consumed people faster than the land could absorb them. Mass graves had filled quickly, dug in haste when killing outran disposal. Bodies were stacked in layers, covered with thin soil, left to rot beneath forests and fields. At first, it seemed sufficient. The victims were gone. The work moved on. But the ground did not cooperate. Rain loosened earth. Gases built up beneath decomposing bodies, forcing them upward. Graves collapsed. Bones broke through the surface. The smell traveled farther than expected, carrying unmistakable signs of what lay below. Villagers complained. Soldiers noticed. Animals dug. The earth itself began to testify. At the same time, resistance had shattered the illusion of perfect secrecy. Revolts in the camps. Escaped prisoners. Rumors crossing borders. The leadership understood that time was no longer an ally. Evidence had to be destroyed, not later, but now. The response was systematic, ruthless, and desperate. Orders were issued to exhume mass graves across occupied territories, not only in the Reinhard camps, but at shooting sites, ravines, forests, anywhere bodies had been buried quickly and without ceremony. The goal was comprehensive removal. No graves, no bones, no proof. The operation had a name, spoken rarely and recorded even less. It was not meant for public knowledge. It was a cleanup, a final act meant to make genocide disappear from the physical world. Prisoners were forced to do the work. Those selected were not told the full scope of what awaited them. They were marched to sites under guard, handed tools, ordered to dig. As soil fell away, the smell hit first, sweet, suffocating, unmistakable. Then the bodies appeared, tangled together, swollen, partially liquefied, clothing fused to flesh. Faces unrecognizable. Children pressed against adults as if still seeking protection. The prisoners retched. Some fainted. Guards beat them back to their feet. The work could not stop. Bodies were dragged out with hooks, stacked on a makeshift piers built from railroad tracks and timber. Fuel was poured over them. Fires were lit. Flames roared high enough to be seen for miles. Smoke thickened, carrying ash that settled everywhere. When the fires burned low, bones were crushed manually with hammers, ground into fragments, then scattered or buried again. This process repeated endlessly. Day after day, grave after grave, the dead were reduced to smoke and powder. There was no ceremony, no pause, no acknowledgement of what had been done. The laborers were watched constantly, shot for slowing down, killed when they collapsed from exhaustion. Their lives were expendable, their knowledge dangerous. Once a site was cleared, it was disguised. Soil was leveled, trees planted, fields reseeded, farmhouses constructed, roads rerouted. The landscape was altered to erase memory, to make it appear as though nothing had ever been there. Camps were dismantled piece by piece. Barracks torn down. Fences removed. Foundations destroyed. Everything that could suggest purpose was eliminated. At Treblinka, a farmhouse was built over the remains. At Sobibór, the forest reclaimed the ground. At Bełżec, trees were planted so densely that the site vanished beneath green silence. The camps ceased to exist not through abandonment, but through deliberate transformation. The men overseeing this phase worked with urgency bordering on panic. They knew the war was changing. Fronts were shifting. The certainty of victory that had fueled earlier confidence was gone. What remained was fear of accountability. Records were destroyed. Files burned. Orders issued verbally. Names avoided. Responsibility blurred intentionally. The fewer documents that existed, the easier it would be to deny everything later. The system had always relied on euphemism. Now it relied on absence. Even the goods stolen during extermination became liabilities. Warehouses were emptied. Valuables redistributed. Inventories altered. Anything that could be traced back to the camps was quietly absorbed or eliminated. The goal was to leave behind no clear thread connecting the Reich to the crimes it had committed. But total erasure proved impossible. The scale was too vast. Too many bodies. Too many witnesses. Too many places altered too quickly. Smoke had been seen. Smells remembered. Trains noticed. Entire communities had vanished, leaving behind empty houses and unanswered questions. The men forced to perform this final labor understood that their fate was sealed. Once the work was complete, they too would be killed. They had seen it happen before. Witnesses were liabilities. Some chose to resist in small ways. They buried fragments intentionally, memorized locations, counted days, smuggled information when they could. A few escaped, carrying knowledge etched into memory by horror. The killers tried to outrun truth, but truth lingered. As the cleanup progressed, the camps fell silent. No more trains. No more smoke. The forest grew still again. On the surface, it appeared that the operation had ended cleanly, efficiently, without trace. But beneath the soil, beneath the replanted trees, beneath the rebuilt roads, the past remained. Not as bodies, but as absence. As voids where communities had once lived. As questions that refused to disappear. This final phase revealed something essential about Operation Reinhard. It was never only about killing Jews. It was about denying their existence entirely, before, during, and after death. The regime did not want graves that could be mourned. It wanted nothing at all. No markers. No memory. No proof. And yet, in trying to erase everything, it exposed its own fear. A system confident in its righteousness does not hide its tracks. It does not burn its records or exhume its dead. It does not plant trees over graves and pretend the land has always been empty. The desperation to erase was an admission. As the last fires died down and the final laborers were killed, the planners believed they had succeeded. The camps were gone. The graves removed. The paperwork destroyed. The land transformed. Operation Reinhard, they believed, had been completed in full. But history does not rely solely on what is left behind in the ground. It survives in memory, in testimony, in fragments carried by those who escaped. It survives in the unnatural silence of places where entire worlds were erased. The killing had ended. The forgetting had failed. And as the war continued to turn against the Reich, the men who had built this system would soon face a different kind of reckoning. One not measured in efficiency or secrecy, but in responsibility. The machinery had been dismantled. What remained was guilt, waiting to surface. The gunfire echoed across the fields at dawn, sharp and final, cutting through the cold air with a violence that felt almost ceremonial. Prisoners were forced to run in lines, stumbling over frozen ground, driven forward by shouts and blows. They knew what this was. They had seen it before. This was not a transfer. This was not labor. This was the end of usefulness. For those who had survived the camps, who had burned bodies, sorted clothing, erased evidence, this was the last act of Operation Reinhard. By late 1943, the operation had reached its grim conclusion. The Jewish population of the general government had been largely annihilated. Ghettos lay empty or destroyed. Bełżec was gone. Sobibór had been dismantled after revolt. Treblinka had vanished beneath a farmhouse and replanted earth. The killing centers that defined Operation Reinhard no longer existed in any visible form. But tens of thousands of Jews were still alive. They were the laborers, the survivors of selection, the witnesses the system had not yet finished consuming. They worked in forced labor camps scattered across the Lublin district, places like Poniatowa, Treblinka, Majdanek. They sewed uniforms, repaired equipment, sorted supplies. They were no longer needed for extermination itself, but they remained dangerous. They knew too much. As the war turned against Germany, fear crept into the upper ranks of the SS. Soviet forces were advancing. Allied bombings intensified. The certainty of victory that once justified limitless brutality began to crumble. And with that fear came urgency. Witnesses had to be removed. Quickly. Completely. What followed was one of the largest single-day massacres of Jews during the entire Holocaust. The orders were issued quietly. Units were reassigned. Ammunition stockpiled. Trenches dug under the pretense of air raid defenses. Loudspeakers were set up. Music was arranged. The machinery that had once relied on gas and deception now returned to bullets, but with experience, scale, and chilling resolve. On the 3rd and 4th of November, 1943, the killing began. At Majdanek, prisoners were ordered to assemble. They were marched in groups toward prepared trenches. Music blared from loudspeakers, not to comfort, but to drown out the sound of gunfire. As each group reached the edge, they were forced to lie down atop those already dead. Then the shooting started. Shot after shot, body after body. Layers of the murdered forming a grotesque human foundation. At Treblinka and Poniatowa, the pattern repeated. Thousands were killed within hours. Men, women, children, skilled workers who had been deemed temporarily valuable were now expendable. The operation was ruthless, methodical, and overwhelming. The earth shook. Blood soaked into the ground faster than it could be absorbed. The music played continuously, a grotesque soundtrack to annihilation. This massacre marked the true end of Operation Reinhard. It was not just the destruction of camps, or the burning of bodies, or the erasure of records. It was the elimination of the last human evidence, the final silencing of voices that could testify to what had happened. The SS referred to it with chilling simplicity, Harvest Festival. It was the harvest of death. Afterward, the trenches were filled, the ground leveled, the labor camps emptied. The Jewish presence in the region was virtually extinguished. Operation Reinhard had achieved its objective not only in killing, but in clearing the land of survivors. For the perpetrators, this was meant to be closure. The machinery that had consumed millions was dismantled piece by piece. Personnel were reassigned to other fronts. Some were sent to fight partisans. Others transferred to concentration camps elsewhere. A few returned to civilian life, carrying with them knowledge they would later deny or minimize. Documents were destroyed, orders forgotten, language shifted. What had once been spoken openly within SS circles became unspeakable even among themselves. The operation that bore Reinhard Heydrich's name faded from official memory almost as quickly as it had unfolded. And yet, its consequences were irreversible. Entire regions of Poland were transformed. Towns that had been majority Jewish for centuries were now silent. Synagogues stood empty or were demolished. Cemeteries desecrated. Cultural life erased so completely that later generations would struggle to imagine what had once existed. The absence was total. Operation Reinhard was unique even within the Holocaust. It was the most concentrated killing operation the Nazi regime ever carried out. Over a span of less than 2 years, more than 1 million people were murdered almost entirely in camps designed solely for death. There was no labor economy to justify survival, no prolonged imprisonment, no illusion of selection. Arrival meant death. And because of that, Operation Reinhard left behind fewer survivors than any other phase of the Holocaust. Fewer witnesses, fewer stories, less physical evidence. It was genocide designed not just to kill, but to disappear. That disappearance shaped how the world would later understand what had happened. When the war ended, investigators found ruins, but few intact camps. They found testimonies fragmented by trauma and loss. They found documents that spoke in euphemisms and numbers, stripped of human meaning. The scale of the crime was difficult to grasp precisely because it had been executed so efficiently. Many perpetrators escaped justice entirely. Some were tried years later. Some received light sentences. Some lived out their lives in anonymity, denying responsibility or claiming ignorance. The system had done its job well. Blame was diffuse, paper trails thin, memories contested. But silence could not hold forever. Survivors came forward. Railway workers spoke. Villagers testified. Fragments were assembled slowly, painfully, into a picture that revealed the true nature of Operation Reinhard. A program of total extermination. A machinery of death that functioned with terrifying speed and precision. The end of Operation Reinhard did not bring peace. It left behind a vacuum filled with questions. How could this happen? How could so many participate? How could killing become routine? How could an entire population vanish in such a short time? These questions lingered long after the guns fell silent. What made the end of Operation Reinhard especially haunting was how deliberately ordinary it appeared to those who carried it out. There was no grand finale, no collapse of the system under moral weight. It ended because it had completed its task. The victims were gone. The killers moved on. And the world, exhausted by war, struggled to fully comprehend what had taken place in forests and fields far from the front lines. Operation Reinhard did not end with liberation. It ended with silence enforced by fear, denial, and the destruction of evidence. Its legacy would not be defined by ruins visited by millions, but by absence, by places where nothing seemed to have happened, yet everything had been destroyed. This absence would shape memory itself. And as the post-war world began the slow process of reckoning, another struggle emerged, one not fought with weapons or camps, but with testimony, denial, and the fragile pursuit of truth. The killing was over. The battle over meaning had just begun. The courtroom was quiet in a way the camps never were. Wooden benches, white walls, papers neatly stacked. Men sat upright in suits instead of uniforms, their hands folded, their faces composed. They looked ordinary now, respectable even. Outside, the war had ended. Cities were rebuilding. Borders were being redrawn. The world was desperate to move forward. Inside the room, the past waited to be named. For the first time, Operation Reinhard entered a space not designed to hide it. The reckoning did not come all at once. It came unevenly, fractured by geography, politics, and fatigue. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied investigators focused on what they could see. Camps that still stood, piles of shoes, barracks left intact. Auschwitz dominated attention because it remained physically present, sprawling and undeniable. Operation Reinhard, by design, had erased itself. Its camps were gone, its graves burned, its documents destroyed. What remained were witnesses, few, scattered, traumatized, and perpetrators who understood exactly how to exploit the absence. Many of the men who had built and run the Reinhard camps melted back into civilian life. Some were captured. Many were not. They returned to towns that had not seen what they had done. They claimed new identities. They found work. They raised families. They learned quickly which words to avoid and which stories to repeat. Silence became a survival strategy, just as it had been for their victims. When arrests did happen, they were often delayed by years. Evidence had to be reconstructed from fragments. Survivor testimonies were incomplete, sometimes contradictory, shaped by trauma and time. Defense attorneys seized on every inconsistency. If a witness could not remember a date precisely, the crime itself was cast into doubt. If a document was missing, responsibility dissolved into bureaucracy. The system that had enabled extermination now enabled evasion. In courtrooms across Germany and beyond, former SS men insisted they had been following orders. that they had guarded gates, not killed, that they had driven trucks, not turned valves, that they had sorted clothing, not selected victims. Each role was described as minor, each action framed as unavoidable. Responsibility fractured into pieces too small, they claimed, to constitute guilt. Judges struggled with crimes of this scale. The legal systems they inherited were not designed to prosecute genocide. Murder was an individual act. Operation Reinhard had been a collective process. To convict one man required proving direct participation in killing. Being part of a system was often not enough. And so many walked free. Some trials did occur. They were slow, contested, emotionally draining. Survivors took the stand and spoke of smoke, screams, engines, fire. They pointed to men sitting just meters away and named them as guards, commanders, executioners. The accused stared back, expressionless, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes shaking their heads. The contrast was unbearable. The men accused of overseeing mass murder spoke calmly. They discussed schedules, procedures, transfers. They referred to the victims as units, transports, numbers. When confronted with survivor testimony, they questioned memory, not morality. They denied intent. They denied knowledge. They denied everything that could not be proven with a document they themselves had destroyed. For survivors, the trials reopened wounds that had never healed. To be asked to recount the worst moments of their lives in sterile rooms, to face men who denied their suffering, to watch judges weigh their pain against technicalities, it felt like a continuation of the violence by other means. And yet, testimony mattered. Each statement pierced the silence Operation Reinhard had been designed to leave behind. Each name spoken anchored memory to place. Each description reconstructed a system the perpetrators hoped would remain abstract, unknowable. Beyond the courts, another struggle unfolded in public consciousness. Many societies were not ready to hear about Operation Reinhard. The scale was too large, the cruelty too total. The absence of visible camps made it easier to doubt. Denial found fertile ground in exhaustion and fear. People wanted closure. They wanted heroes and villains, not systems that implicated ordinary men. In Germany, the post-war years were dominated by rebuilding. Former Nazis held positions of authority. Entire institutions were staffed by people who had lived through the regime and adapted to its fall. Pursuing justice aggressively risked destabilizing fragile political structures. And so, for years, accountability was limited, selective, cautious. The result was a second erasure. Operation Reinhard slipped to the margins of Holocaust memory. It was mentioned briefly, if at all. Auschwitz became shorthand for genocide, while the camps that killed more people in less time faded into obscurity. This was not intentional denial in every case. It was the outcome of visibility. What could be visited was remembered. What had been burned and replanted was easier to forget. Survivors understood this deeply. They watched as memorials were built elsewhere, as textbooks simplified history, as public ceremonies focused on places with ruins and museums. They knew that the forests of Bełżec, Sobibór, and Treblinka held stories no stone marked clearly. Some dedicated their lives to changing that. They wrote memoirs. They gave interviews. They returned to sites where nothing remained and pointed to ground that looked ordinary, insisting that this was where it happened. They spoke to students, historians, anyone willing to listen. They carried memory as a burden and a duty. Their voices challenged not just denial, but indifference. Over time, historians began to piece together the full scope of Operation Reinhard. Railway records, surviving correspondence, post-war confessions. A clearer picture emerged of a program that had murdered more than 1 million people with terrifying speed and efficiency. The narrative shifted from isolated atrocities to a coherent system of extermination. But this understanding came late. By the time Operation Reinhard entered broader historical consciousness, many perpetrators were already dead. Justice, where it came at all, felt incomplete. Sentences were light, convictions rare. The scale of the crime dwarfed the consequences imposed on those responsible. This imbalance haunted survivors and scholars alike. The trials revealed a truth that extended beyond any single case. Genocide does not require monsters. It requires structures that normalize obedience, reward efficiency, and diffuse responsibility. Operation Reinhard was not the product of sadists alone. It was built by administrators, engineers, clerks, guards, people who returned to ordinary life when the system collapsed. That realization was unsettling. It threatened comforting narratives about evil as something distant and rare. As denial persisted in some circles, so did efforts to confront it. Memorials were eventually established at former campsites, even where nothing visible remained. Museums documented Operation Reinhard in painstaking detail. Names were recovered when possible. Numbers contextualized. Absence explained. Education became a battleground. To remember Operation Reinhard required explaining how something so vast could be designed to leave so little behind. It required confronting the fact that genocide can be efficient, quiet, and bureaucratic. That it can operate without spectacle. That it can vanish if no one insists on remembering. The legacy of the operation, then, was not confined to history. It was a warning about memory itself, about what happens when crimes are hidden successfully, about how easily absence can be mistaken for innocence. For decades, the forests remained quiet. Trees grew tall where gas chambers had stood. Birds nested where fires once burned. To the untrained eye, there was nothing to see. And yet, beneath the soil, beneath the silence, the truth endured. Operation Reinhard did not end when the killing stopped. It continued in courtrooms where justice faltered, in societies that struggled to acknowledge what had happened, in the slow, uneven process of turning testimony into history. The battle was no longer over lives. It was over meaning. And as the world moved further from the events themselves, another danger emerged, one perhaps even greater than denial. Forgetting through distance. Forgetting through simplification. Forgetting through the comfort of believing that what happened was inevitable, or incomprehensible, or confined to the past. The survivors knew better. They understood that memory is not passive. It must be defended, repeated, insisted upon. Operation Reinhard had been built to erase people completely. To undo that erasure required effort, courage, and persistence long after the camps were gone. The trials ended. The files were closed. The defendants aged. Some died quietly in their beds. The question that remained was not whether justice had been served. It was whether the truth would survive. The place looks empty now. Grass grows where tracks once ended abruptly. Trees sway where fences once cut the air into corridors of fear. Birds move freely through spaces where no one was ever meant to leave alive. If you did not know what happened here, you would pass by without slowing down, without sensing anything wrong. And that is precisely what the architects of Operation Reinhard wanted. Not just death, but normality afterward. This final silence was the operation's last objective. Operation Reinhard did not leave behind the ruins that later generations would walk through in shock. It did not leave towering chimneys or preserved barracks. It left absence. It left gaps in census records. It left towns without Jews, streets without voices, languages without speakers. It left forests that learned how to keep secrets. And because of that, its legacy has always been fragile. More than 1 million people were murdered in less than 2 years. Almost all of them killed within hours of arrival. Almost all of them erased so thoroughly that even their deaths left little physical trace. Entire communities that had existed for centuries vanished in weeks. Synagogues fell silent. Cemeteries were desecrated or forgotten. The rhythm of daily Jewish life in Poland, markets, prayers, schools, songs, was extinguished with terrifying efficiency. This was genocide compressed into its most concentrated form. Operation Reinhard revealed something fundamental about modern mass murder. It did not require chaos. It did not require hatred shouted in the streets. It required planning, schedules, paperwork, cooperation between offices that never saw the victims themselves. It required people willing to reduce human beings into logistics. That is what makes it so dangerous to forget. For decades after the war, Operation Reinhard existed mostly in footnotes. Auschwitz became the symbol of the Holocaust because it remained visible, because it left behind structures the world could not ignore. But Reinhard had succeeded too well. Its camps were dismantled, its graves burned, its evidence scattered. What remained were testimonies, few, fragmented, often ignored, and silence filled the rest. This silence allowed denial to grow, not always in loud, obvious ways, but in quieter forms, in omissions from textbooks, in simplified narratives, in the belief that the Holocaust was only about camps with gates and slogans, not about forests and railway sidings that looked ordinary. But the truth is more unsettling. Operation Reinhard shows how quickly a society can move from exclusion to annihilation once human beings are reduced to problems that need solving. It shows how language can anesthetize conscience, how euphemisms can smooth the path to murder, how distance can dissolve responsibility. It shows how ordinary men can become indispensable parts of an extraordinary crime without ever believing themselves to be criminals. The men who designed the operation did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as administrators, problem solvers, efficient, necessary. That belief did not disappear with the camps. It survived in post-war careers, in courtroom defenses, in quiet lives lived without consequence. This is why memory matters. Not memory as ritual alone, but memory as understanding. Understanding how extermination became routine, how murder became work, how silence became policy, how an entire operation could be built around the idea that if no one remained to speak, the crime itself would dissolve into history. But history does not dissolve that easily. Survivors carried Operation Reinhard with them for the rest of their lives. In nightmares, in fragments of smell and sound, in the unbearable knowledge that entire worlds have been erased and that so few people knew their names. They spoke not because it healed them, but because silence felt like a second death for themselves and for those who did not survive. Historians followed those voices back into the forests. They mapped what had been hidden. They reconstructed what had been dismantled. They traced rail lines, orders, personnel. Slowly, painfully, Operation Reinhard emerged from the shadows, not as a footnote, but as one of the central mechanisms of the Holocaust. And with that emergence came responsibility. Responsibility to name the victims, even when names are missing. Responsibility to mark places where nothing seems to have happened. Responsibility to resist the comfort of forgetting simply because the evidence was deliberately erased. Responsibility to recognize that the absence itself is the evidence. Operation Reinhard teaches that genocide does not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as administration. Sometimes it leaves nothing behind but silence and numbers. Sometimes it depends on the hope that future generations will be too distracted, too distant, too uncertain to ask what once stood where trees now grow. The final truth of Operation Reinhard is not found only in death counts or timelines. It is found in what was removed from the world and what that removal allowed to happen afterward. It is found in how easily absence can be normalized if no one insists on remembering what filled it before. This is why this history cannot end with the camps. It ends with a question. What do we do with knowledge like this? Do we reduce it to statistics and dates? Or do we allow it to change how we understand power, obedience, and moral responsibility? Do we treat it as a tragedy sealed safely in the past, or as a warning embedded in the structures of modern life? Operation Reinhard was not an accident. It was a choice made again and again by people who believed that efficiency mattered more than humanity, that obedience mattered more than conscience, that silence mattered more than truth. Those choices did not end in 1943. They remain possible wherever people are reduced to problems, wherever suffering is hidden behind procedure, wherever disappearance is mistaken for resolution. The forests of Poland are quiet now, but they are not empty. They hold memory in their soil, in their absence, in the stories that survived despite every attempt to erase them. Operation Reinhard did not fail because it killed too many people. It failed because it could not erase the truth. And as long as that truth is spoken, clearly, precisely, without distortion, the operation remains unfinished in the only way that truly matters. Because remembering is the one thing it was never designed to survive.